Hey, quick heads up before I get started. I will be spoiling some parts of Lies of P and the DLC, as well as very small pieces of Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and Hollow Knight. So, fair warning. Designing a boss fight isn't easy. Designing a good boss fight, even less so. There's so many factors that go into making a compelling boss fight, and often, when a fight really works, it's hard to pinpoint a specific reason why. If you'll allow a cheeky simile, a well-designed boss fight is like a well-refined recipe, with every ingredient working in harmony, adding to the experience, even if it itself can't be directly tasted. Today, what I want to talk about, though, is a phenomenon that I've observed multiple times, even in some of my favorite games. What's tricky is that, while I feel this phenomenon, this type of boss design, detracts from the experience, it doesn't necessarily make a bad boss. Therefore, this is a more nuanced area of discussion. But what is this boss design phenomenon? For lack of better wording, or admittedly research into whether or not this has a name already, I'll be calling this Runaway Freight Train Boss Design, or RFTBD, which is admittedly a very unhelpful acronym. To describe the idea of RFTBD, I've come up with 5 pillars that seem to be consistently present among bosses in this grouping: weight, speed, relentlessness, durability, and simplicity. One more quick note though, before we get into those. This video is mostly in regards to conventional bosses, whatever that means. But bosses don't have to serve that conventional role. They can be employed for a number of reasons, including creating a misleading sense of comfort, expanding on the story, or even foreshadowing future encounters. Anyway, looking at the pillars, weight is perhaps the simplest one to start with. Just like a freight train, bosses in this grouping pack heavy punches. They deal considerable damage relative to the standards of the game, and therefore are capable of enacting brutal punishment whenever the player slips up. As a result of this, these fights tend to demand a disproportionate amount of attempts in relation to their other characteristics. In other words, the boss may have a very simple moveset, but if they're capable of one-shotting the player, it could still take a while to defeat them. Now let's talk about the second pillar, speed. Similar again to a runaway train, is the idea that these bosses are also relatively quick, especially in relation to the weight behind their hits. Of the many things that require careful balancing in boss design, strength to speed is one that's often featured fairly prominently. Generally, a really fast boss will hit lighter, as the higher pace of the fight can create tension that might otherwise be generated by the threat of getting hit. In slower fights, the pace can't drive tension as much, meaning that it instead has to be generated from the threat of letting even one hit land. Regarding RFTBD bosses, the pairing of both high speed and strength has the potential to artificially inflate the difficulty, creating frustration in players that feel a high degree of punishment is holding them back from progressing in the fight. In the same vein as high speed, another key aspect of these bosses is their relentlessness. While a boss may have speedy combos, a lack of breathing room between these combos is what can really make a fight start to feel overwhelming. To clarify, I'm not saying that bosses should give players a bunch of breaks in the fight, because that kind of ruins the tension, although, again, I'd like to reiterate that I'm talking about a traditional boss fight. Gimmick or, story-first fights might not necessarily care that a player feels tense the whole way through. In general, though, breaks in the action are a precious resource that designers must carefully control in order to keep player investment. However, it's certainly possible for this resource to be too scarce, and at a certain point, most players just won't be able to fully keep up, removing an element of mastery from the fight and swapping it for some degree of luck. When this element is added to speed and strength, it can hinder the feeling of attainability that a player ideally holds onto, even if it's slim. If the fight barely seems possible, most players are less likely to be motivated to put in the time. Building on the first 3 aspects, that being weight, speed, and relentlessness, is when the boss is also extremely tanky. We've all had those fights where we land our first attack, only to see a minuscule amount of health disappear, and get the sinking realization that we're in for the long haul. As with all the other aspects, this is not necessarily a bad thing. A really tanky boss can communicate might, status, power, all sorts of things. Carefully leveraging this, as a design aspect, communicates to the player that they're going up against something big. Think Yorm in Dark Souls 3, for instance. His massive health pool indicates his status as a giant, and also that the player should be looking for an alternative tool to win the fight, as FromSoft will never force players to tackle a health bar like that with just their normal moveset. However, this, in combination with the three preceding aspects, again, makes for an often less appealing combo. There are those bosses, for instance, that pancake us so badly on our first attempt that the fight seems impossible. In this situation, one of the worst follow-up realizations is that we can do little to retaliate and have to resort to whittling away the boss's health, largely at the mercy of whatever quick, heavy-hitting moves they can muster. On top of all four other aspects that make a case of RFTBD is the fact of the fight being very straightforward. Some boss fights are wildly creative, innovative, and dynamic. Their move pools are extremely diverse and test the player's mastery over their entire skill set. The bits and pieces I've played of Sekiro are a prime example of this, asking the player to pull out all of their evasive powers, even in early fights. Sometimes, even just visual variety in a fight can make that fight engaging. In a true case of RFTBD, however, this is not really the case. If all four of the previous factors come together, the fight can still be enjoyable, if a little bit difficult. But if the boss itself is just not that compelling, then this can easily shatter any remaining motivation. Like I mentioned before though, a boss with all five of these characteristics is not necessarily bad. It could still have a sick character model, the soundtrack could still slap, its connection to the story or lore could be very well done. From a purely gameplay perspective though, I do think that a boss that's a victim of Runaway Freight Train boss design tends to suffer. The spark of inspiration for this video idea came from my time so far with Lies of P Overture. I was frustrated and I was looking for a way to vent, and this was going to be my way to do so. However, I realized that that really isn't too helpful to, well, anyone. Plus, I'm a game design student, so I should probably at least try to be a little more analytical when it comes to something like this. To that end, what I want to talk about now is why this design might be employed for a boss, and what aspects can be tweaked to improve the gameplay experience. The classification of boss is a vastly unhelpful term. A boss in a video game can be anything from a moss monster to a literal god, and everything in between. Sure, we have additional classifications, mini-boss, final boss, to name a few, but these do little to fix this problem. That being said, there are some common themes to many boss fights, one of which being that they should challenge the player. Again, not necessary, but common. The task of creating a challenge, however, is complicated. Now, it's not actually all that difficult to make a boss fight hard. There are so many tools that a designer can employ to get the better of a player. What is difficult, however, is managing that challenge, constraining it so that the fight still feels achievable and engaging. How does this tie into RFTBD though? In my opinion, RFTBD tends to come about as a supplement, a means of inflating boss difficulty, largely without the need to change the fundamentals of the boss. In other words, it can act as a way to adjust difficulty while requiring a relatively low time commitment. Circling back to the nuance of this topic, the fact that this design often feels somewhat tacked on or last minute goes to show that a boss can suffer from this and still be great at its core. Now, at this point, I have been talking about a lot of more abstract concepts, and so I think it would be helpful for me to give some more concrete examples. Like I mentioned, I'm currently working my way through the Lies of P DLC. In general, I think it's a great DLC. The scenery is gorgeous, the level design is the best we've seen out of the game so far, and the new items are really exciting. Honestly, I think that the core boss designs are on point as well. Markiona is one of the best examples of a duo fight in a game that I've ever seen. The new green monster fight is a fun remix of a fight that already remixed an earlier boss, and even something simpler like Tyrannical Predator sets a good tone for gameplay by introducing the player to what they can expect out of the DLC. That being said, I don't think that the bosses are perfectly balanced. One example that I think falls into RFTBD is the two-faced Overseer. At the start of the fight, it's just really a heavy-hitting enemy with a lot of health and some fairly simple patterns, which is not inherently bad. In fact, I think the core concept for this boss is really strong. The two-faced idea has lots of potential for gameplay shakeups, and the delay on its attacks takes a second to get used to when trying to parry, which forces the player to take a step back and really learn the patterns. Unfortunately, however, its transition to red mode is what, in my opinion, hurts the fight. While there is some gameplay difference, with the boss acquiring some new moves, it mainly just becomes faster and more unrelenting. Another big offender, in my opinion, is Veronique. In general, I find Lies of P's NPC fights to be among the weakest aspects of the game, as they often feel designed around a different skill set. The main bosses of the game feel designed around the core identity of combat. Things like the heavy commitment on attacks, parrying combos, guarding, dodges in select situations, etc. While the NPCs often seem like they'd be more at home in something like Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring, a game with a more nimble protagonist. Veronique, unfortunately, is, in my opinion, the most extreme example of this idea. The NPC hits just as hard as other bosses, and yet seemingly also has gains in speed, closing massive distances both in and out of attacks. Additionally, her multi-step reactionary moves don't leave much room for punishment, even once the player knows what to expect. On top of this, she has the staple of the DLC, a considerable health bar. Despite all of that, unfortunately, her move pool also comes down to little more than a variety of hammer swings when it comes to attacks. I'd like to stress again that I don't think, at its core, that this is a bad boss. The idea of lingering fire, for instance, is really cool. I love when bosses force you to navigate the arena with more intentionality. It's the reason why Quelaag is one of my favorite fights from Dark Souls 1. I also think that a rocket hammer is badass, and having enemies that can close distance quickly is also a cool mechanic in fights that can add fun pressure. There's a lot to like from a design perspective. I just wish that the last push to get it up to desired difficulty wasn't just cranking the numbers. Now, I don't mean to hate on Overture. I can think of examples in other games of RFTBD too. Failed Champion and Hollow Knight is one of the main reasons why I never actually got into True Ending when I was speedrunning the game. Elden Ring bosses are often guilty of this to some degree, with the most egregious base game example I can think of being Gideon. Again, these are cool boss concepts. The idea of dream rematches in Hollow Knight had so much potential to recontextualize and reimagine the fights for a later game player. Pure spellcasters are rare opponents in Elden Ring, making Gideon an idea with a lot of promise. Unfortunately for those examples, I just think that the final balancing was flubbed a little bit. My goal with this video is not to hate on Runaway Freight Train boss design. I'm not a big fan of it, but it's not a cardinal sin or anything, and as someone who's made their own games, I understand how decisions like this can come about. Game development is stressful and requires constant management of priorities. In all likelihood, if a boss starts to fall into RFTBD domain, it's probably just the result of more important tasks that were in the queue first. I also don't mean to hate on Lies of P Overture with any of this. At the end of the day, it's really just more Lies of P, and I can't complain about that because this game is one of my top 2 all-time favorites. When I played through it for the first time last summer, that was the most invested I'd been in a new game since I played Hollow Knight in 2020. I do have some frustration around the balancing of the DLC, but that's more just because I respect the base game so much for largely avoiding this trap. What was so alluring to me about this game, and specifically the boss fights, was that it derived difficulty from complex, intricate, and wildly engaging boss movesets. Things didn't necessarily hit super hard, but their wacky attacks forced you to really learn the timings until you could make your opponent look like a complete joke. The progression from insurmountable wall to complete pushover is a large part of what made Lies of P so great. This identity of the bosses is something that I haven't seen to quite the same degree of consistency yet in the DLC, as good as I think it is. I guess if you take anything away from this, I hope it's that difficulty isn't just about numbers. Design unique and unprecedented fights, and you'll likely find your difficulty along the way. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, consider liking or subscribing. I do want to make more videos, and I'm currently working on a game with some friends that I'd like to start sharing about soon. I'd also love to hear other examples of these kinds of bosses if you can think of any. Or if you have thoughts about what I talked about, please feel free to share. I love game design discussion, especially because it's so highly subjective, so I'd welcome any opinions, whether they're similar to mine or completely different. Thanks again, and see ya.